Los Angeles, 3:15 in the afternoon. According to the catastrophic model laid out in a 1966 manuscript once locked inside a classified government vault, this is the moment the ground stops behaving like ground. Not an earthquake, not a warning tremor. The entire crust of the planet, according to this account, lurches sideways in a matter of minutes, and the ocean outside the city stands up like a wall 2 miles high. Winds hit 1,000 miles per hour. Not hurricane winds, not even the worst tornado ever recorded. Winds fast enough to strip bark from trees, flatten steel frame buildings, and hurl debris with enough force to level anything left standing. And behind that wind comes the water, a wave taller than any mountain range on the American continent, sweeping east across California, over Nevada, over what used to be solid ground, freezing solid within hours as the newly relocated poles drag Arctic temperatures over cities that were basking in springtime sun that same morning. San Francisco is gone before nightfall. New York, on the opposite side of the shift, according to the manuscript's model, doesn't fare any better. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, according to this same account, human civilization doesn't end with a bang so much as it gets erased, flash frozen, buried, geologically overwritten, the way it may have happened at least 5 times before in Earth's deep history. This is the opening scenario laid out in a book called The Adam and Eve Story, written by a former defense engineer named Dr. Chan Thomas. And here's the detail that turns this from pulp disaster fiction into a real historical mystery worth investigating. The Central Intelligence Agency classified this manuscript, not once, but twice, decades apart. A private citizen's self-published book about pole shifts and ancient floods, sitting inside a government vault under a classification stamp usually reserved for matters of national security. Why would America's premier intelligence agency care about one engineer's theory of ancient cataclysms? Is there a scientific mechanism buried in Chan Thomas's pages that deserves a second look, decades after the CIA first buried it? And are we, right now, drifting toward the same geological tipping point his manuscript describes as the trigger for the last global reset? By the end of this video, you'll have the full history of this document, the real science it was built on, and the honest verdict on whether any of it holds up. Let's start at the beginning. Chan Thomas wasn't a novelist. According to his own biographical claims, he trained as an engineer, and by the account that circulated after his book resurfaced, he spent time working in the aerospace and defense sector, eventually landing at McDonnell Douglas, one of the 20th century's largest military aircraft and spacecraft contractors, a company with direct ties to NASA's Gemini and Skylab programs, and to the Pentagon's most sensitive weapons projects. This is a man who spent his career around classified engineering, around men who built the machines that flew astronauts into orbit and delivered warheads across oceans. And in 1963, according to the record, Chan Thomas filed a formal proposal directly to the CIA. Not a novel pitch. A proposal describing what he believed was hard evidence for a recurring planetary catastrophe, one triggered not by asteroids or nuclear war, but by the Earth's own crust slipping violently across its interior. 3 years later, in 1966, he self-published his findings as The Adam and Eve Story. The title alone tells you where he was going with this. His argument was that the biblical Adam and Eve, and the flood myths embedded in dozens of cultures worldwide, weren't religious allegory. They were folk memory, garbled, generations-old eyewitness testimony of the last time this happened to us. The book didn't sell in any meaningful way. It vanished into obscurity, one of thousands of self-published fringe manuscripts printed and forgotten during the 1960s, and it likely would have stayed forgotten if not for what happened decades later. In 2013, a Freedom of Information Act request pulled a copy of The Adam and Eve Story out of the CIA's own declassified reading room, stamped, filed, and sitting in an agency archive that specializes in national security material, not amateur geology. The mere presence of a self-published pole shift book inside a CIA vault was enough to set conspiracy researchers into motion, and the story metastasized from there. Word spread that only 57 pages had been released, a tantalizingly small fraction, researchers assumed, of a much longer original manuscript, with the rest supposedly redacted, withheld. Too dangerous to declassify. Whatever the truth of that 57-page number turns out to be, and we're going to dig into that later in this video, the fact remains that the CIA held onto this document for decades, reviewed it for release, and only handed it over after a formal legal request forced their hand. That alone raises a question worth sitting with. Why does a national intelligence agency keep tabs on an engineer's theory about ancient pole shifts for half a century? To answer that, you have to understand what Chan Thomas was actually claiming happened to this planet. And to do that, we need to go back further than 1966, to the scientist whose work Chan Thomas built his entire theory on top of. According to the manuscript, the trigger for global catastrophe isn't the crust cracking apart. It's the crust sliding, the entire outer shell of the planet, oceans and continents together, rotating as a single unit around the semi-liquid layer beneath it, while the deeper interior and the planet's axis of spin stay locked in place. Picture the Earth as an orange with its peel loosened. Squeeze the fruit, and the peel can rotate independently of the flesh inside. That's the model Chan Thomas describes, a rigid outer shell, floating on a molten layer, capable of shifting its position relative to the poles without the planet's actual rotation in space changing at all. The manuscript's proposed trigger for a shift is a buildup of ice at the poles. Antarctica, according to this model, accumulates enormous, asymmetrical ice mass over thousands of years, not evenly distributed, but concentrated in ways that create a wobble, a centrifugal imbalance acting on the spinning crust like a poorly loaded washing machine drum. Eventually, the manuscript argues, that imbalance reaches a tipping point, and the crust breaks free of its friction with the layer beneath it, lurching to a new position in a matter of hours, not centuries. The result, in the model's own terms, is what we opened this video with. Regions that were once temperate suddenly find themselves at the new poles, buried instantly under ice. Regions that were once frozen suddenly sit at the new equator. The transition itself, the manuscript insists, isn't gradual. It's closer to slamming on the brakes in a car doing 200 miles per hour. Everything not bolted down, including oceans, continents worth of water, and every living thing on the surface, keeps moving under its own momentum, while the ground underneath changes direction and speed almost instantly. This is the engine driving those 1,000-mile-per-hour winds and those 2-mile-high walls of water in the manuscript's opening chapter. Not a hurricane, not a tsunami in the conventional sense, the physical consequence of the solid Earth suddenly moving out from under an ocean that hasn't caught up yet. It's a vivid, terrifying model. And Chan Thomas didn't invent the underlying concept from nothing. He was building, some critics would later say borrowing heavily, from a real, credentialed scientist who published a very similar theory over a decade earlier, and who counted among his correspondents one of the most famous physicists who ever lived. In 1958, a professor named Charles Hapgood published a book called The Earth's Shifting Crust, laying out what he called the Crustal displacement hypothesis, the same basic mechanism Chan Thomas would later popularize in fictionalized, dramatized form. Hapgood's version was more academic, more cautious in its numbers, but the core claim was identical. The Earth's outer shell can and has shifted relative to its spin axis, dragging climates and coastlines into entirely new positions within a geologically short window of time. Here's the detail that gave Hapgood's work unusual credibility. Albert Einstein, in the final years of his life, wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book. Einstein didn't personally verify Hapgood's data, and he was careful in his own words to frame the crustal displacement idea as a serious hypothesis worth investigating rather than settled fact. But having arguably the most respected physicist of the 20th century put his name on the foreword of a fringe geological theory was enough to keep the idea alive in serious scientific conversation for years afterward, rather than dismissing it outright as pseudoscience. Hapgood followed up in 1970 with a second book, The Path of the Pole, expanding his argument and pointing to a piece of physical evidence he considered central to his case, a 19th century, no, more precisely a 16th century nautical chart known as the Piri Reis map. Drawn in the year 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, the Piri Reis map depicts the coastlines of Africa and South America with a degree of accuracy that impressed 20th century cartographers. But the detail that fascinated Hapgood and later fueled decades of speculation was a southern landmass on the map that some researchers interpreted as the coastline of Antarctica, rendered, they argued, without the ice sheet that has covered the continent for millions of years. If that interpretation is correct, it would mean whoever originally mapped that coastline saw Antarctica ice-free, which under mainstream geology would place that original survey tens of thousands of years in the past. Long before any civilization, we have direct evidence of possessed the seafaring technology to chart it. Mainstream cartographic historians dispute this interpretation heavily, generally identifying the southern landmass as a distorted or imaginative rendering of South America's coastline rather than Antarctica at all. But for researchers inclined to believe Hapgood's crustal displacement theory, the Piri Reis map became a kind of physical exhibit, proof, they argued, that someone, at some point in deep history, saw the world in a configuration that doesn't match our current one. Between Hapgood's academic framework and Einstein's cautious endorsement, the idea of a real crustal shift had just enough scientific texture that it wasn't purely fringe. And that's exactly the material Chan Thomas would later dramatize, expand, and eventually stamp his own name onto in The Adam and Eve Story, a manuscript that pushed Hapgood's careful hypothesis into a full-blown extinction-level catastrophe narrative. But a mechanism, even a compelling one, needs supporting evidence beyond a single contested map. And this is where the legend widens out to claim an entire planet's worth of buried scars. If a global cataclysm really did flatten civilization within the last several thousand years, you'd expect the survivors to remember it, passed down generation after generation in the oldest stories every culture tells. And according to researchers working in this same speculative tradition, that's exactly what we find. Flood myths appear independently across roughly 40 distinct cultures worldwide. The Mesopotamian account of Utnapishtim, the Hebrew story of Noah, Hindu texts describing Manu and a great deluge, Mesoamerican flood traditions among the Aztec and Maya, Aboriginal Australian stories of rising waters, and Norse mythology's own flood narrative involving the blood of the giant Ymir. Mainstream folklorists generally explain this pattern as a natural consequence of humanity settling along rivers and coastlines prone to catastrophic flooding, with independent local disasters generating similar stories through shared human experience rather than a single shared event. But to researchers in the Crustal displacement camp, 40 independent civilizations converging on the same core narrative, global water, mass death, and a small group of survivors starting again, reads less like coincidence and more like collective memory of one specific planetary event. Physical evidence gets stranger still once you turn to the Great Sphinx of Giza. Mainstream Egyptology dates the Sphinx to roughly 2,500 years before the Common Era, attributed to the pharaoh Khafre. But geologist Robert Schoch, examining the deep rounded erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls, argued publicly that the weathering pattern matches water erosion, heavy rainfall over an extended period, rather than the wind and sand erosion you'd expect in Egypt's desert climate for the last 5,000 years. If Schoch's water erosion reading is correct, it would push the Sphinx's true age back into a much older, much wetter climate period in North Africa, one that mainstream chronology doesn't currently account for. Mainstream archaeologists have pushed back hard against this dating, citing the lack of any corresponding archaeological culture in Egypt old enough to have built it. But the debate, contested as it is, has never fully closed. Then there's a formation in Mauritania that satellite imagery turned into an internet sensation the moment high-resolution orbital photography became publicly available. The Richat structure, nicknamed the Eye of the Sahara. A nearly perfect set of concentric rings, roughly 25 miles across, visible clearly from space. Mainstream geology explains the Richat structure as an eroded dome of uplifted rock, a natural geological formation with no human origin whatsoever. But its almost unnervingly symmetrical, ring-within-ring shape has fueled decades of speculation that it might be the remains of a much older, wave-carved coastal formation. Some fringe researchers have gone as far as proposing it as a possible location for the legendary lost city of Atlantis, its concentric canals long since fossilized into stone. Mainstream science treats this identification as pure speculation with no supporting evidence, but the shape alone keeps the theory circulating. And the legend doesn't stop at Africa. Cross the globe to the Western Pacific, and you find the sunken structures near Yonaguni, Japan, a series of stepped, angular stone formations discovered underwater in 1986. Debated ever since between geologists who see natural sandstone fracture patterns and researchers who see deliberately carved terraces and pathways, submerged as sea levels rose after the last ice age. Nearby, on the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, sits Nan Madol, a genuine, undisputed megalithic city built from massive basalt columns stacked into nearly 100 artificial islets, connected by a network of tidal canals so extensive that early European explorers nicknamed it the Venice of the Pacific. Nan Madol's origins are historically documented, generally attributed to the Sodalur dynasty roughly 1,000 years ago. But its sheer engineering scale, using columnar basalt transported from distant quarries with no known mechanical assistance, has kept it inside the same broader legend of forgotten, high-capability ancient civilizations. Further east, on Easter Island, the enormous stone moai statues carry their own piece of this puzzle. For centuries, the statues were assumed to be heads alone. Archaeological excavation in the 20th century revealed that many of the moai have full bodies, buried up to the shoulders under centuries of accumulated soil and sediment, a detail that fringe researchers point to as evidence of dramatic, rapid landscape change, while mainstream archaeology attributes it simply to slow, ordinary erosion and soil deposition over hundreds of years. Taken individually, mainstream science has a grounded explanation for every single one of these sites. Taken together, according to the legend Chan Thomas's manuscript feeds into, they form the scattered footprint of a single lost seafaring culture, sometimes called Mu, sometimes Lemuria, a civilization advanced enough to carve stone with precision and move it across oceans, wiped from history by the very cataclysm his book describes. If Chan Thomas's manuscript stood alone, it might have stayed in total obscurity indefinitely. But his Crustal displacement narrative slotted almost perfectly into predictions made decades earlier by two of the 20th century's most famous prophetic figures. The American psychic Edgar Cayce, working through trance readings in the 1930s and 40s, predicted specifically that the Earth's axis would shift, that California would experience catastrophic destruction, and that the lost continent of Atlantis would begin to resurface from the ocean floor near Bimini in the Caribbean, a prediction some researchers connect to the discovery in 1968 of an underwater formation off Bimini known as the Bimini Road, a series of large flat limestone blocks arranged in a pattern some divers interpreted as a submerged roadway or wall. Mainstream geology identifies the formation as a natural beach rock formation, fractured along consistent geological joint lines. But its timing, discovered decades after Cayce's prediction, gave the Crustal displacement legend one more coincidence to point to. Centuries earlier, the French astrologer Nostradamus, writing in the 1500s, produced a body of ambiguous quatrains that later interpreters have connected to everything from world wars to pole shifts, depending on which translation and which century you're reading them from. Chan Thomas's manuscript, according to researchers who've cross-referenced the material, drew loose parallels between his own predicted catastrophe timeline and interpretations of Nostradamus's writing, positioning the coming shift as part of a repeating historical cycle rather than a one-time event. That cyclical framing is central to the manuscript's entire argument. According to the model, this isn't the first time civilization has been reset by a crustal shift. It's potentially the sixth. Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, whatever names you want to apply to these lost pre-flood cultures, all according to this narrative, rose to a level of sophistication comparable to or exceeding our own, only to be erased by the same geological mechanism over and over, stretching back tens of thousands of years. It's an audacious claim, tying together fringe geology, disputed archaeology, psychic prediction, and a 500-year-old set of poetic riddles into one continuous narrative arc. And it's exactly the kind of narrative that, once it reached the internet age, was primed to explode. But before we go further into where this legend has taken people, it's worth stopping here and doing something most retellings of this story skip entirely, actually checking the receipts. Here's where we put the brakes on the dramatic momentum and look hard at the actual documented facts, because the honest version of this story is almost as interesting as the legend and considerably more useful. The claim that exploded across the internet after the 2013 FOIA release was that only 57 pages had been declassified out of a much larger, deliberately withheld original manuscript. Researchers who've compared the released CIA document against surviving printed copies of The Adam and Eve Story from later editions have found that 57 pages matches the length of the original 1963 or 1965 draft John Thomas submitted directly to the agency. Not a redacted fragment of a much longer censored book, but essentially the complete early manuscript as he wrote it. Later, expanded editions of the book, published commercially in 1993 and again in later reprints, ran considerably longer, incorporating additional material Thomas developed over the following decades. In other words, the 57-page number reflects an early draft's actual length, not a CIA redaction job. That doesn't make the CIA's involvement uninteresting. It's still a genuinely unusual fact that the agency held onto a private citizen's pole shift manuscript for roughly 50 years before releasing it under legal pressure. But the specific narrative of only 57 pages out of hundreds appears to be a misunderstanding of the document's actual history, rather than evidence of a broader cover-up. John Thomas's own biography holds up to scrutiny in some respects and gets murkier in others. His connection to McDonnell Douglas and his engineering background are generally consistent with the record, positioning him as someone genuinely embedded in Cold War-era defense and aerospace work, which likely explains why the CIA took his 1963 proposal seriously enough to review and file it in the first place, rather than dismissing it outright. But independent researchers who've dug into his later life have also described him as an increasingly eccentric figure over the following decades, someone who continued revising and self-publishing his theories with escalating urgency and increasingly specific catastrophe timelines that repeatedly failed to materialize, and the physics itself has real, documented problems. John Thomas's model relies heavily on the weight and asymmetrical distribution of polar ice as the primary trigger for a crustal shift. Geophysicists studying Hapgood's original hypothesis back in the 1950s already identified the core issue. Antarctica's ice sheet, while massive, simply doesn't carry enough asymmetrical mass to generate the centrifugal force needed to drag the entire rigid crust of the planet into a new position within hours or days. The physics doesn't scale. Ice at the poles has real effects on sea level and climate. But the crustal displacement mechanism as originally proposed requires forces well beyond what actual polar ice accumulation can produce, according to mainstream geophysical modeling that has held up for over half a century since Hapgood first published. That's the honest scientific verdict. John Thomas's catastrophic 90-degree crustal slide within a matter of hours is not supported by mainstream geophysics, and the CIA classification mystery, while genuinely unusual, appears to have a far less dramatic explanation than decades of forum speculation assumed. But, and this is the twist that keeps this topic worth covering seriously rather than dismissing entirely, throwing out John Thomas's extreme model doesn't mean throwing out every underlying concern, because there is something real happening to this planet's magnetic field right now, and it deserves your attention far more than any 1966 manuscript does. Earth's magnetic North Pole is not fixed. It moves constantly, and scientists have been tracking its position for well over a century. For most of the 20th century, magnetic north drifted at a steady pace of roughly 9 miles per year, slow enough that it barely registered outside specialist circles. Since the turn of the millennium, that drift has accelerated dramatically. Magnetic north began moving at a rate approaching 40 miles per year, a pace so unusual that in 2019, the World Magnetic Model, the primary navigation reference used by military systems, commercial aviation, and smartphone compasses worldwide, had to be updated years ahead of its normal schedule because the pole had already moved too far from its predicted position for the existing model to remain accurate. This accelerated drift is tied to real, measurable changes happening in Earth's outer core, where the planet's magnetic field is generated through the movement of molten iron thousands of miles beneath the surface. Scientists studying this process have also documented a broader, longer-term weakening of Earth's overall magnetic field strength, dropping by a measurable percentage over roughly the last 2 centuries, concentrated especially in a region over the South Atlantic known as the South Atlantic Anomaly, where the field is measurably weaker than anywhere else on the planet's surface. A weakening magnetic field matters because that field is our planet's primary shield against the sun's most dangerous output, coronal mass ejections, massive eruptions of charged solar plasma flung directly at Earth during periods of high solar activity. In 1859, an event called the Carrington event sent a coronal mass ejection into Earth's magnetic field, so powerful that telegraph systems across North America and Europe sparked, caught fire, and, according to multiple documented accounts, continued transmitting signals even after operators disconnected their batteries, powered entirely by the induced current from the storm itself. A Carrington-level event happening today would not just knock out telegraph wires. Modern civilization runs on interconnected electrical grids, satellite networks, and digital communication systems, all of which are vulnerable to the same kind of induced electrical surge that fried telegraph lines in 1859. Experts who study this risk have estimated that a direct hit from a Carrington-scale coronal mass ejection could knock out large sections of the electrical grid across North America and Europe for months, with cascading effects on water treatment, food distribution, and medical systems that depend on a functioning grid to operate. In 2012, a coronal mass ejection of comparable strength to the Carrington event crossed Earth's orbital path and missed our planet by roughly 9 days. A near miss that NASA scientists have publicly stated could have caused trillions of dollars in damage and years of recovery time had the timing been different. So here is the honest, science-backed version of the warning buried inside Chan Thomas's dramatized manuscript. The specific mechanism he proposed, a 90-degree crustal slide triggered by polar ice imbalance, wiping out civilization in a single catastrophic day, does not hold up against real geophysics. But the broader instinct underneath his warning, that our planet's magnetic system is dynamic, currently accelerating in unusual ways, and directly responsible for shielding modern civilization from a solar threat capable of crippling our electrical infrastructure, is not fringe speculation at all. It's an active area of serious scientific monitoring, discussed openly by NASA, NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center, and geophysicists tracking the magnetic pole's ongoing acceleration in real time. Whether or not you believe a former McDonnell Douglas engineer stumbled onto evidence of a cyclical, civilization-ending crustal catastrophe, or whether you think the Adam and Eve story is simply an over-dramatized manuscript wrapped in a genuinely curious footnote of Cold War classification history, one thing is certain. The Earth beneath your feet is moving in ways scientists are still working to fully understand. The sun above you is capable of a strike we've already experienced once in recorded history. And somewhere between fringe manuscript and verified science, the line is a lot thinner than most people assume.